Hey guys, Mike here, the Detroit Borg, with a look at the very inexpensive Motorola Moto E. This retails for $129 off contract. This is sold globally, runs on 3G networks, not LTE, has a 4.3-inch LCD display with a resolution of 540 by 960, which is good for 256 pixels per inch. This is also powered by a Snapdragon 200 processor, which is a dual-core clocked at 1.2 gigahertz. That's a Cortex A7. We also have 1 gig of RAM and an Adreno 302 graphics processor. Now we only have 4 gigs of internal storage, but you do get an SD card slot, which is expandable up to 32 gigs. Now this is running the latest version of Android, 4.4.2, but it has pretty much feature phone pricing, so it's a very inexpensive phone with the capabilities of the most modern version of Android. So let's get into this packaging and take a look. Now this is available in white or black. It also comes available with these not smart shells, but Moto E shells. So you can change the back color, and I'll show you exactly how to do this when we take a look at it. Now those shells are only $15, so that's a fairly inexpensive accessory. So there we go. I have the white version, which comes with a white faceplate, a white bezel, and a white back plate, which again, you can change out. Now in terms of accessories, there really isn't much. I just have a charger, although I think there are versions that are sold with headphones. Mine didn't come with them. So this is a fixed charger, actually. I'm not gonna take it out here, but it's just a USB charger. You can't remove the cable, so it's a micro USB charging cable. And I assume it's color matched to whatever version you got. So I have the white for the white phone. You probably get a black one with the black phone. Now in terms of paperwork, we have our safety, warranty, and regulatory information. We also have a quick start guide in English, and then we have one in Spanish. All right, so let's take a look at the design of the Moto E, which is running a fairly stock version of Android with a few Motorola tweaks, which we'll explore here. But again, we have that 4.3-inch LCD display, which isn't terribly bright, and the off-axis viewing angles aren't great. So you can see they kind of lose color here. This is not as good as the Moto G, for example. Now, if we look at the back, we have this nice curved back panel, which is very familiar territory for the Motorola phones. The Moto X and the Moto G pretty much have the same design characteristic with that kind of palmable design. Very nice looking. Along the back, you can see we even have that curve toward the top where the headphone jack is, along with the microphone. Now on the back, you'll find our camera module, which is recessed. Now, unfortunately, with that recess, it does tend to collect dust, as you probably can see here, so you have to keep that clean. But again, that's a 5 megapixel rear-facing camera with a fixed focus lens. There is no autofocusing here. Also missing is an LED flash, so again, no LED flash with the Moto E, while the Moto G and of course the Moto X get one. Now, you also find this characteristic Motorola branding that is in that sort of dimple design toward the back here, so it gives you something to kind of place your finger on to orientate your phone with. Now at the bottom of the phone, we'll find a micro USB charging port. Not much along the left-hand side here. Toward the top, we'll find a headphone jack and microphone. And toward the right-hand side, we'll find a sleep-wake power on and off button, along with a volume rocker. As you can see here, they are chromed. Now, these are kind of mushy buttons. They're not the most tactile buttons in the world, and part of the problem actually lies with the design of the edge of the phone. So as you can see here, it kind of angles toward the display, and when you reach around to operate these buttons, there's actually a bit of a barrier here toward the back of the phone from operating these controls. So they're a little less tactile than I'd like to see. Now those chrome details are picked up on the front of the phone with a chromed earpiece and chromed loudspeaker. A lot of times I actually mistake this for a home button out of instinct, but that is just a loudspeaker. It is covered in this chrome piece, possibly to resist dust, but also it gives you this nice wide speaker so you don't accidentally cover the speaker when you're holding it, which is quite nice. And again, it's very nice to have a front-facing speaker instead of a rear-facing or side-firing speaker, so it's quite loud and at least faces the user as opposed to what most phones do. So you can see we also have these on-screen Android keys, which are translucent, so you can see the wallpaper through it, but of course not all apps take advantage of that. So when you open up most apps, they will give you that black bar, which takes up some of the screen real estate. Now toward the top, again, we'll find our earpiece. That is also chrome, similar to the loudspeaker at the bottom. We also have an ambient light sensor and proximity sensor, but there is no front-facing camera. There's only one camera, and that's on the back of the phone. Now, they did retain this white LED notification light, as you can see here, which is invisible until lit. Now, if you're wondering, these two speakers are not stereo speakers. This is the loudspeaker, that is the earpiece. These do not operate as stereo speakers like you might see on the ACC1 M8 or the Sony Xperia Z2. Alright, so let's go and take a look at the user interface. Again, we're running Android 4.4.2. So the lock screen, you can swipe up from the bottom to get to Google Now really quickly. You can also swipe to the left to launch the camera app. Again, this is very similar to a stock Android experience. We'll explore the camera app a bit later. You have your drop-down notification shade. Again, very similar to stock Android with your expandable notifications. You can also clear them all or jump right to your quick settings. Now, the quick settings are basically toggles here. They'll take you either to the control panel or they'll take you to external controls like your brightness slider right here. Now you can see we do have auto mode because we do have an ambient light sensor. Now you can also use a two-finger gesture to get to those controls. And if you want to jump to your full settings panel, you can do so right here. Now in terms of our Android keys, we have our home button. We can also tap and hold to get to Google Now. Takes us to Google Now. And then we can say, okay, Google, is it going to rain tomorrow in Chicago?
No, rain is not expected tomorrow in Chicago.
Now we also have our recent apps button. Again, very familiar to stock Android. You do not have a clear all option here, but you can swipe them out of the way to close them or launch them directly like so. Now in terms of home screens, they've given us 5 fixed home screens. You can tap and hold anywhere on the home screens to get to your wallpaper editor. You have this Google widget, which is always present. Now you can't say, okay, Google, to activate it. You do have to press it. Now if you tap and hold the power button, you have the option to power off, select airplane mode, mute it, vibrate, or turn on the sound. Now if you look at the app drawer, it's pretty much the stock Android experience. So we have tabs for apps and widgets, and we can also swipe through them. We also have a shortcut to the Google Play Store. Now the app selection is pretty much all Google. So we have mostly Google apps in here with a few Motorola apps. So the Motorola apps include Alert, Assist. We also have an FM radio tuner built in. We have a help support document. We also have a dedicated SMS messaging app. Of course, you can use Hangouts for that purpose if you prefer. And then we have Motorola Migrate. So let's talk about some of these apps. Now, the Alert app is new with the Moto E and the Moto G with LTE. Basically, this is an app that allows you to share your location with designated emergency contacts. So for example, if you hit this emergency button, it will sound an alarm and send a text message to predetermined contacts to let you know that you need help, and it will tell them your location. Now, Motorola Assist is basically a do not disturb feature. So as you can see here, we have meeting mode and sleeping mode. Now, sleeping mode is pretty basic. So during certain times of day, you can mute your phone. So if you select silence now, you can select specific times of day. So for example, if you go to bed at 11 p.m. and wake up at 6 a.m., this will automatically mute your phone so you don't receive notifications. But you can specify certain contacts that can break through that do not disturb feature. So you can add favorites, or if somebody tries to call twice, it will break through. Now, we also have meeting mode, which will silence the phone if it sees on your calendar that you're in a meeting. So for example, if you select silence here, you can modify this behavior here. So you can silence all notifications and vibrations. You can allow vibrations only, allow certain calls to come in, or if somebody calls twice. You also have auto reply options. So you have one canned message, but you can go ahead and edit this message if you prefer. And again, if you're in meeting mode, it will automatically send an auto reply to that contact who's trying to reach you. Now we also have the FM radio. Now the FM radio is pretty basic, but you do have to connect a set of headphones to act as your antenna. Now as you can see here, it has already scanned my channels, my local channels, and found all my stronger signals. So I can see that I can select one of my radio stations here. I can stop it and play it, so it does cue the music for you. You can also select specific stations if you want them to be your favorites, and you can go to your favorites right there. Again, it's kind of nice to have. Now we also have Motorola Migrate, which allows you to migrate from either an Android phone or an iPhone. So if you have an iPhone, click Next here. Basically what you do is log into your iCloud account. So it plugs into your iCloud account and downloads all your calendar events and contacts to your phone. And of course, we have the full suite of Google apps to give you a full featured experience. We have a calculator, a calendar, we have the email app and Gmail app, Google Search, Google Drive for cloud storage. We have the Chrome browser and the Clock app, as well as downloads. We have a Gallery app, as well as the Photos app, which works with Google+. We have the Google+ app, Search, Hangouts for SMS and Hangout messages. We have Google Maps for navigation. We have our contacts, our phone dialer, which is close to stock, although slightly different. We also have playbooks, games, movies, TVs, music, and Play Newsstand for periodicals. We have the Play Store and Quick Office for creating or viewing documents either in Word, Excel, or PowerPoint. Now the settings panel is pretty close to stock. So you have your Wi-Fi controls, you have your Bluetooth settings. So of course you can enable Bluetooth to use Bluetooth headsets or sync this to your car. Under More, you have Your airplane mode, default SMS app, so you can select your default app. If you prefer, you can go with the one that Motorola includes or Google's Hangouts. Tethering and portable hotspotting, VPN, mobile networks, mobile plan, as well as emergency alerts, which is where you can control these. As you can see, I have them all checked on. In fact, they were all on by default. Now under sound, again, it's pretty close to stock, but they have added audio effects, which is an equalizer. This is Motorola's contribution to this panel. So you can see we have wired stereo and our speaker. So, for example, you can select your profile here. 3D stereo was the defaulted one. You also have home theater, live stage, and custom. If you go to custom, you can also select your surround mode from wide to live to ambient or off. Same with your equalizers here. You have lots of equalizer options. Now, you can't manually adjust these. Also, under speaker, you have a few options here. Extreme bass, bass punch, balance, brilliant treble, vocalizer, or off. You also have your volume control, so you can independently control your volumes. This is not readily available from the volume controller, so you can't press this and get to settings. You actually have to go to the settings panel to get to this. So you can see you can modify ringtones, the music, video games, and other media, as well as your alarm settings. Now, I think the Motorola phone ringtone is kind of obnoxious, so you can see this is the default ringtone. And of course you can select others. Now under display you have the standard array of settings such as your brightness controls, your wallpaper, auto rotate screen on or off. You also have your sleep time, daydream mode, which you can toggle so you can change exactly what you want, whether you want the clock, colors, Google Photos, the photo frame, photo table, etc. You also have your font size, so you can adjust font size. You also have the pulse notification light, which you can turn off, and you can cast your screen using the Chromecast device. Now in terms of storage, there isn't much. Again, there's 4 gigs of storage in here, but you really only have access to 2.21 gigs of that. The rest is for the system. So you can see you're probably going to need to add an SD card. I've only downloaded a couple of apps and taken a few photos and videos here, so you can see I've already nearly maxed out. Now we also have Motorola Device ID, which uses your Google account for Motorola services. In this case, we have MotoCare tips and Lost Phone web portal. So I'm using my Google account to track down this phone. So if it's lost or stolen, I can lock it or erase it or GPS locate it using the web portal. And of course, we have our accounts information, so we can add additional accounts. We have date and time, accessibility. We have our printing options. Again, 4.4 does support printing. And if we go to About This Phone, again, you can see Android version 4.4.2, KitKat. Now let's take a look at Motorola's camera app, which is pretty basic. Again, we don't have autofocusing here, so you tap anywhere on the screen and it snaps the photo for you. You can zoom in and out by swiping up or down with one finger. You can record video by going up here. You can also zoom in and out while recording video, like so. You can pause recording and then resume it. And then you can stop it right up here. Now you can swipe in from the left edge to get to your settings. So as you can see here, we have HDR, which you can set to auto, on or off. You also have the option to control your exposure with this utility. So when you have this enabled, you can move this around to adjust your exposure to whatever point you want to adjust to. So for example, darker up here or lighter right there. And then you just tap to take your photograph. Now when you're done with that, you can toggle that off. You also have panorama mode, which you can turn on. You have geolocation, which I have turned on already. Now if you have an SD card slot, you can change your storage to the SD card slot by selecting that controller here. You can also change this from 4:3 to 16:9, but 4:3 gives you the higher resolution. You also have the option to turn off your shutter sound. And when you're done taking your photos, you can swipe to the left to get to your gallery. Now, of course, with a lower price point, you get lower specs. With lower specs, you get lower performance. And the Moto E obviously is at the bottom here, below the Moto G, at least on the multi-core score, while the single-core score is very close. And, of course, well below the Moto X across the board. Now, let's briefly compare the Moto E to the Moto G to the Moto X. The Moto X is a 4.7-inch display, much higher resolution. This has an OLED display. It's one of the better OLED displays I've used. It's very bright and clean. It's not as bluish as a lot of OLED displays tend to be. Again, this is more edge-to-edge, so there's a little less bezel here. So it's a little more screen, a little less device in the way. The Moto E is a relatively bulky compared to its display size. The Moto G is 4.5 inches, so it is a larger display over a very similar footprint as well. Now, the Moto E has a larger, although lower resolution display than the iPhone, 4.3 inches versus 4 inch. This has a pixel density of 326. This has a pixel density of 256. It's also a much dimmer display, a more yellow display. Also doesn't look as good off axis as the iPhone. So there's a huge difference in display quality, but you can see it's larger. But the good thing here is that it's not substantially larger than the iPhone in terms of its footprint. It's a much thicker phone, but you can see there's less bezel surrounding the display than there is on the iPhone. Now, the iPhone is much narrower than the Moto E, as you can see here, so it's a little more comfortable to grip in your hand, even though the bezels at the top and bottom are taller. Now, as I said, the back cover is removable, and you have these multicolored shells which you can purchase separately for $15 each. So let's go ahead and pop off the back shell to show you this. It's kind of difficult sometimes to get this one off. It's a little more rigid than the one on the Moto G. Now, with the back cover removed, we can see we have a sealed-in battery. This is a 1,980 milliamp hour battery. And as you can see here, we even have our Motorola dimple still there. Now, this is where we access our micro SD card slot and SIM tray. This is a micro SIM. As you can see, I already have a SIM inserted. Now, you can see they're clearly marked and spring-loaded. Now, let's go ahead and pop open this cover accessory here. Alright, so I'm going to try and remove this piece of paper here. Now, the cover is really thin, but it's very rigid thanks to its design. So let's go ahead and snap this into place. So there we go. We have a two-toned Moto E, white and blue, which I think is a nice combination. Now, in terms of fit and finish, I do notice that the top of the case tends to kind of rattle when you tap it. So it feels a little looser than I would like to see. This is true of the included white case as well. It seems to be more rigid toward the bottom than toward the top. So let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the Moto E. And I think the biggest strength here is going to be pricing. $129 off contract. Get you an Android phone that's running the latest version of Android that's nearly stock on one of the best displays at this price point. Most phones at this price are running an old version of Android that's heavily skinned on a lower quality display. It also has that surprisingly good loud front-facing speaker, which makes a big difference here. Most speakers are facing toward the rear or toward the edge, and even if it may not be louder than those speakers, the fact it's facing the user makes a big impact. I'm also pretty impressed by the battery life. I'm able to get at least 9 hours out of heavy use on this phone while reviewing it. And that's thanks to the fact that it's running fairly old hardware. So we have a Snapdragon 200 processor, which is not terribly demanding. We also have that dimmer, smaller display, which again doesn't suck a lot of power from the battery. And then we have 3G instead of LTE, which is also kinder to the battery. Now, in terms of weaknesses, I think the biggest one for me is the display. Now, I think the display is sharp enough, 256 pixels per inch. I have no issue with the resolution. Again, it's one of the higher resolution displays at this price point. But the quality of the display is the issue I have. It's kind of dim, it's kind of yellow, and it has pretty terrible off-axis viewing. So I'm constantly trying to increase the brightness of the display because it just can't keep up with something like the Moto G or the iPhone or that sort of thing. But again, of course, pricing and battery life are affected by those things. Now, of course, the other big weakness here is the camera, or the one camera that's on the back. That's a 5 megapixel fixed focus camera, which produces pretty decent images in bright sunlight conditions outdoors with plenty of distance between you and the subject, but it's pretty hard to get sharp images if the subject is close to you or if the subject is in low light. Color saturation is also pretty low, and when you're in low light conditions, the frame rates really drop, especially on video. And when you're taking photos in low light conditions, the frame rate of the camera is so low that it's pretty hard to get a sharp image out of it. So definitely a mediocre camera. And then we have no front-facing camera, so a lot of apps can take advantage of that front-facing camera now, especially chat apps, and that's not available at all. Now, the other issue is performance and storage. Now, we're running a stock version of Android, which is pretty decent, but you still notice some frame dropping and performance issues, and you're gonna have to do a lot of maintenance in terms of killing background apps to free up that 1 gig of RAM. But otherwise, I found performance to be pretty decent, but that wasn't my experience initially. I actually found the keyboard to be very laggy, apps were slow to launch, but over time, it seems performance improved. Now, the other issue is storage. You only have 4 gigs of internal storage. Only 2 gigs are available to the user, which doesn't leave a lot of room for photos, videos, as well as apps. And of course, if you want to expand storage, you're going to have to factor that into the cost of the phone. Now, I think it's pretty easy for a lot of people to dismiss the Moto E when the Moto G is only $50 more. Now for me, I think that's the case. I think I would recommend the Moto G. I have a hard time recommending the Moto E, but the Moto E, $50 cheaper, gets you the option to expand storage. So although you only have 4 gigs, at least you can expand storage, which you can't in the baseline Moto G. Now the Moto G comes with a much better 5 megapixel camera with autofocusing and an LED flash and a front-facing camera. It also has a 4.5-inch display with a pixel density of 326. That display is much higher quality with great off-axis viewing, much brighter and much more accurate colors. But of course, $50 is a lot of money to a lot of people. And with the Moto E, you get a very similar experience, you get very similar software experience, you just give up some features that may or may not be important to some users. So in the end, I think the Moto E is a great value, especially if you're in the market for a very low-end smartphone that runs the latest version of Android. You really can't beat it. So that's going to do for me in this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next.